Manila is an old form of currency, and it looks like this. Back in the day, 1 manila was equal in value to 1 slave. You could purchase 1 slave with 1 manila. This cover shows 2 manilas. I also see what looks like 2 people to me. Clearly this is like them in the ocean, the darker gray being the water, the lighter gray being the sky, but I see 2 people, 2 slaves, since that's what the manilas represent, kind of hugging each other, kind of helping each other out. I also see this being 2 manilas looking like they're about to either form a chain or a chain is breaking. Okay, and that's going to be relevant later when we start talking about long chains. We'll get into that later, but that, or of course chains that kept slaves in bondage. The slaves or the manilas, their heads are barely above the water. Okay, and that can mean of course a lot of things, like they're barely treading water, they're dying, or in the context of the album, for them that's actually a good thing, and I'll get into that later as well. You also have this black line of like the sea line going directly through their heads, and I'm not sure if that's supposed to represent the death of the slaves who actually did die in real life. The line itself is at an angle, which I think represents a wave. If the line was flat, just horizontal, it would be like a calm sea, but this is at an angle, which I think is a minimalistic representation of like water with waves. I also think that the white lines on this album kind of represent something more than just kind of boxing in the painting. I think the white lines are representative of literally slavers and possibly just white people in history who have owned and used certain people, you know, from Native Americans to black people, either as slaves or just taking their land or whatever. I also think that the white lines might represent beaches in the different places that this album takes us, or that the different places that the slaves would have gone depending on what place they went to. He mentions that the reason that the beach is sand and the shores are white is because the bones of the slaves who died end up washing up on these beaches. I'll get into this more later. And lastly, if you really want to look too deep into it, that same shoreline, that same water line is dividing darker from lighter. The cover shows us slaves by showing us the manilas, which are basically the equivalent to a slave in the context of this album. We have the water and the sky being the dark gray and the light gray, which go on to represent other things later in the album. From these things, and from what I've interpreted, you can see them dying by drowning, or possibly helping and saving each other from dying. The vision with the line and welcoming and accepting each other with kind of that hug looking type thing. So now we're gonna look at the very first track. Well, first let's look at a timeline. Okay, there was like God, right? And then there was like the Big Bang, right? And then there was like Jesus, and then slavery happened, okay? And then we get to 1781. These slave owners threw 133 slaves off a ship just so they can collect the insurance money on these slaves. And then a couple years later, like 30 years, okay, my guy Thomas Clarkson writes a book about how slavery was bad and shit. Shout out to Manila Thomas. Then another 30 years passed, and this book by my dude Thomas inspired this dude JMW Turner to make this painting, right, about these slaves. You know, I'll let you look at the painting in a little bit, but he made this painting about anti-slavery shit. He wanted his painting to inspire his king or prince or whatever the fuck they had in Great Britain at the time. His name was Albert. He wanted to inspire him to be more inspired to go after anti-slavery across the world, and not in just Great Britain, where they had already abolished slavery in 1833. But now we're in like 1840. He put this painting out, and at the event he was going to show Prince Albert this painting, he put the following poem next to it.
Aloft all hands strike the topmasts and belay. Yon angry setting sun and fierce edged clouds declare the typhoon's coming. Before it sweeps your decks, throw overboard the dead and dying. Ne'er heed their chains. Hope, hope, fallacious hope. Where is thy market now?
You know, when we first come across this painting, it looks really beautiful.
But then my eye goes to the bottom right-hand corner, and in a moment of horror, I see a foot and a leg and a shackle in chains, and all of a sudden it's not a seascape, and it's not about a sunset, and it's not about light on the water.
There's real carnage right in front of us. In fact, in the closest part of the painting, this is a ship carrying slaves, and a typhoon has come on. This is based on a poem.
And again, there's this mixture of the beauty of nature, the power of nature, and this horrific human act that is within the context of a much wider horrific human act of slavery.
We do have this sense of divine retribution, the storm coming for that slave ship that's been dealing in human lives, and the punishment wreaked by nature. is justified on that ship. But there's also a sense of the total indifference of nature, because the same storm that's going to overcome that slave ship is also going to drown the slaves themselves.
Nature is completely indifferent to the human endeavors, whether they are good, evil, otherwise, whatever.
This idea that human beings could do this to each other, not just in the form of actual slavery, of buying and selling human beings, but also in terms of taking advantage of one another just for the sake of money. And of course, that's the kernel of this hideous act that the captain engages in here.
You might be wondering, why did I just show you this painting for 2 minutes? Why did I have you listen to what these ladies were saying about this painting for 2 minutes? This intro song is a poem from a painting. This painting has been seen on Lupe Fiasco's personal SoundCloud on multiple audio tracks, but on a specific audio track where he talks about how he's coming up with the story for this album, how mythology and a lot of the things that he talks about on this album are things that he is very interested in. All that to say, this painting may be the direct inspiration, or what this painting represents is probably the direct inspiration for what Lupe Fiasco did with this album. Okay, the idea of slavery, not just in a literal sense of slaves from Africa, but in the sense of slavery to what we do today, to where we're slaves to our phones, to where we're slaves to social media, whatever you want to connect your personal slavery to. This is what he's talking about. Okay, so before we go into this album, you have to kind of have, or you should have, a backstory, an understanding of where he's coming from, where this picture's from, what this intro track of random poem being spoken comes from. And I think I just did that pretty well. So as we go forward, the characters that have been introduced in this first, just with the cover of the album and this first piece of knowledge that he gives us, are themes that go throughout the entire album. I hope we do a good job together breaking this shit down, because I know I'm gonna get some stuff wrong or I might miss some things. So if you notice something or got some information, leave it in the comments. But this is just the beginning. Drogas Wave. Appreciate y'all for watching. CELLY.